Welcome to my channel. I hope you find this narrative engaging. Let's get started. I was standing in front of the mirror, fixing my tie. Another day, another transaction to seal. Life was pleasant, or so it seemed. My reflection gazed back at me, assured and calm. Salvador Bell, the man who seemingly had everything. "Darling, have you seen my blue folder?" Crystal's voice floated from the bedroom. "Check the office," I replied. Our daughter, Victoria, bounded into the room, her pigtail bobbing. "Daddy, can we visit the park after school?" I crouched down, locking eyes with her. "Absolutely, princess. I'll fetch you at 3:30 on the dot." Crystal showed up at the door, her expression preoccupied. "I've got a late meeting tonight. Don't hold dinner for me," I frowned. It was the third instance this week. She dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "You know how it is, the Henderson account is vital." There was something unsettling in her voice, but I dismissed it. "All right, I'll look after Victoria," I stated as Crystal hurried out, barely stopping to peck Victoria goodbye. An uneasy feeling lingered. Over recent weeks, she had become more remote. Our once fiery relationship had cooled to indifferent chatter and routine interactions. At work, focusing was a struggle. My thoughts continuously drifted to Crystal's actions, the cancelled dates, the premature departures, the way she shunned my touch. It felt like cohabiting with a stranger. My phone vibrated, a message from Crystal: "Running late. Don't collect Victoria. Tracy will bring her home." I sighed, massaging my forehead. This wasn't the first time Crystal had neglected our daughter. Victoria's forlorn expression flashed through my mind, igniting a burst of anger. As I drove back, I resolved to confront Crystal. This couldn't continue. Our family was disintegrating, and I needed explanations. The house was pitch dark when I arrived, no trace of Victoria or Crystal. I checked my watch, 7:30 p.m. Where were they? I dialed Tracy's number, Crystal's closest ally. "Hey Tracy, it's Salvador. Is Victoria with you?" "Oh, hi Salvador," Tracy responded, her tone notably jovial. "Yes, she's here. Crystal asked me to have her for a sleepover. Didn't she inform you?" My hand clenched, the phone tighter. "No, she didn't. Where's Crystal?" She mentioned she had a work dinner. "I'm sure she'll be back soon." I could detect the dishonesty in Tracy's voice. "Thanks, Tracy. Tell Victoria I love her." Hanging up, a chilling dread settled in my stomach. Crystal wasn't at work. She wasn't with our daughter. Where on earth was she? I paced the living room, various scenarios racing through my head. Was she in danger, involved in an affair? The notion made my blood seethe. Hours ticked by. I repeatedly dialed Crystal's phone, each call going straight to voicemail. By midnight, I was poised to contact the police, but at 1 a.m., I heard the front door open. Crystal staggered in, her hair tousled and clothes crumpled. "Where have you been?" I inquired, my tone steady yet stern. She flinched, startled by my presence. "Salvador, I told you I had a late meeting." "Don't fabricate," I snapped, stepping closer. "I called your office. They said you left at 5. Crystal's eyes flickered around the room, avoiding my stare. I went for drinks with colleagues, lost track of time." "And your phone, why didn't you respond?" "Battery died," she murmured, trying to brush past me toward the bedroom. I seized her arm, compelling her to face me. "What's happening, Crystal? And don't say it's nothing. You've been peculiar for weeks." For a moment, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, then it vanished, replaced by icy defiance. "I don't owe you explanations, Salvador. Let go of me." I released her arm, taken aback by the venom in her tone. This wasn't the woman I married. As she stormed off to the bedroom, I remained there, feeling as though my entire world was falling apart. Sleep was elusive that night. I lay awake, replaying every excuse, every missed call. The pieces were coming together, forming a distressing picture. I did not want to admit that my wife was concealing something, but I was determined to discover what it was, regardless of the expense. The subsequent days were a haze of doubt and quiet strife. Crystal and I scarcely communicated, avoiding each other like tired strangers. I immersed myself in my job, yet my thoughts were obsessed with uncovering the reality. One evening, as Crystal was preparing to leave, I nonchalantly inquired, "Where are you headed?" "To my book club," she answered, avoiding eye contact. I nodded, observing as she hurried out the door. As soon as her car departed, I grabbed my keys. It was time to conclude this masquerade. Following Crystal's car was challenging. She took a circuitous route, doubling back several times, but I was ready for this. I maintained my distance, my heart pounding, as we left the familiar streets of our neighborhood. Eventually, Crystal's car pulled into the parking lot of the Rosewood Hotel. A knot formed in my stomach as I watched her step out, straightening her dress and checking her reflection in the car window. I parked across the street, my hands trembling as I took out my phone to record. Crystal walked into the hotel lobby, her eyes scanning the area. Then I saw him, a tall, well-dressed man with sandy hair. He approached Crystal with a closeness that infuriated me. Toby R., I recognized him from Crystal's work functions. The way he placed his hand on the small of her back, the intimate smile they exchanged, it was all the proof I needed. I wanted to burst in there to confront them, but a cold, strategic part of my mind restrained me. I needed more proof, more leverage. For the next hour, I sat in my car, snapping photos and recording snippets of their conversation whenever they passed by the windows. Each laugh, each touch, was like a dagger in my heart. When they finally left, Toby pulled Crystal close, kissing her deeply. I clenched my steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened, resisting the urge to charge at them. As Crystal drove off, I trailed Toby. He led me to an upscale apartment complex across town. I noted the address, my mind already crafting a plan. The next day, I called in sick to work while Crystal was at the office. I paid a visit to Tracy. It was time to get some answers. Tracy opened the door, her insincere smile wavering when she saw my stern expression. "Salvador, what are you doing here?" I barged past her into the house. "We need to talk, Tracy." Now she wrung her hands nervously. "I don't understand what you mean, stop the nonsense," I snapped. "I know about Toby. I know Crystal has been dishonest. What I don't know is how long you've been helping her." Tracy's face fell. "Salvador, I'm truly sorry. I wanted to tell you, but Crystal, she swore me to secrecy, tell me everything I demanded," my voice cold. And so the entire sordid story spilled out. Crystal and Toby had been involved for months. They were planning to elope, taking Victoria with them. "She was going to leave you penniless," Tracy cried. "Toby's been assisting her in shifting funds. They planned to empty your accounts and vanish." I listened in grim silence, each word fueling the anger mounting within me. When Tracy finished, I stood up. "Salvador, what will you do?" she asked, fear evident in her eyes. I looked at her, my tone ominously serene. "You have nothing to worry about, Tracy. But if you mention this conversation to anyone, especially Crystal, you'll regret it." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. As I drove to Toby's apartment, my mind was piercingly clear. The pain, the betrayal, it all merged into a focused intent. They thought they could ruin me. I was about to show them what real destruction looked like. Toby's building had minimal security, making it almost effortless to enter. I picked the lock on his door, a skill from my more reckless days that was now proving invaluable. The apartment was stylish and contemporary, reeking of expensive cologne. I methodically sifted through drawers and files, photographing everything that could prove valuable: bank statements, emails, love letters from Crystal. Each discovery fueled my anger further. I was so engrossed in my task that I barely noticed the key turning in the lock. Panic surged through me as I realized Toby was home early. There was no place to hide. As the door swung open, I made a split-second decision. I grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight from the desk and positioned myself behind the door. Toby entered, humming to himself. As he turned to shut the door, I struck. The paperweight connected with a sickening thud, and Toby crumpled to the floor. For a moment, I stood frozen in shock. Then, training kicked in. I checked for a pulse. It was gone. "This wasn't part of the plan," I muttered. But as I gazed at Toby's lifeless body, a strange calm enveloped me. In a way, he had simplified things. I surveyed the room, my mind racing. I couldn't undo what I'd done, but I could shape the narrative. Working swiftly, I made the apartment look like the scene of a botched robbery. I pocketed some cash and valuables, smashed a window, and wiped down every surface I had touched. As I left, I felt no remorse, no guilt, only satisfaction. Toby had tried to take everything from me. In the end, I had taken everything from him. Now it was Crystal's turn. The next few days required a delicate balancing act. I had to play the role of the unsuspecting husband while meticulously covering my tracks. The news of Toby's death spread quickly, sending shockwaves through Crystal's social circle. I observed her closely, noting every twitch, every poorly hidden tear. She was adept at concealing her grief, but not enough. To the world, she appeared as a concerned colleague. To me, she was a widow in all but name. Such a tragedy, Crystal murmured during dinner, pushing food around her plate. Toby was a valuable member of the team, I nodded solemnly, taking a sip of wine. Indeed, the police believe it was a robbery. Crystal's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. That's what they're saying. It's just so senseless, life often is, I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. As days passed, Crystal's behavior became increasingly erratic, alternating between periods of eerie calm and sudden outbursts of anger or tears. I knew it was only a matter of time before she unraveled. I needed an ally, someone I could trust implicitly. That's when I turned to my best friend, Santos. Santos and I had a long history dating back to our law enforcement training days. He had left the force to start his own security firm but maintained his connections. Importantly, he was the only person I knew I could rely on completely. We met at a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. Santos took one look at my face and ordered a bottle of whiskey. "All right, amigo," he said, pouring us each a generous measure. "Spill it." I recounted everything: the affair, the plot against me, and finally what happened with Toby. Santos listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he let out a long, low whistle. "Damn, that's one hell of a mess, I know," I replied, downing my drink. "But I need your help, Santos. I can't go down for this. I've got Victoria to think about." Santos leaned back, his eyes shrewd. "What do you need? An alibi for the night Toby died? And advice on how to stay ahead of the investigation?" Santos stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you follow my lead, no questions asked." Relief washed over me. "Got it. Thank you, Santos." Over the next few hours, we meticulously constructed my alibi. Santos would swear we were together that night, working late on a new security system for my company. We went over every detail, ensuring our stories aligned perfectly. "Now," Santos said, his voice low and serious, "you need to get rid of anything that could link you to Toby's place. Clothes, shoes, everything. Burn it if you have to." I nodded, embedding his instructions in my memory. "And Salvador," he added, gripping my arm, "no matter what happens, you stick to the story, even if they bring Crystal in." "Even if she breaks, you know nothing," I confirmed. "Understood," I replied as I drove home that night, feeling a peculiar mix of fear and excitement. The situation had evolved. It was no longer just about exposing Crystal, it was about survival. The next few weeks felt like walking a tightrope. At work, I kept up a facade of normalcy, closing deals and engaging clients, but internally, I was always tense, anticipating the next development. Crystal's announcement of her pregnancy was explosive. She cornered me one evening, her eyes frantic. "I'm pregnant, Salvador," she blurted out. "It's our miracle." I felt my face lose color. "Our miracle, the cruelest joke of all." "That's wonderful news," I managed to say, even as my mind raced. The timing, the desperation in her voice, it left no doubt in my mind about whose child she was carrying. Crystal threw her arms around me, crying. I held her rigidly, my heart hardening. She thought this baby would save her relationship, bind me to her. She was oblivious to the tempest approaching. As Crystal stepped back, wiping her eyes, I made a decision. For now I would play along, let her think she had won, but ultimately she would lose everything, just as she had planned for me. "We should celebrate," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll make dinner reservations for tomorrow." Crystal's face lit up with relief. "Oh, Salvador, I was so worried. I thought, with all the distance between us lately," I caressed her face, the gesture tender but my touch icy. "Nonsense, this changes everything." As I embraced my deceitful wife, my mind was already plotting several steps ahead. The child complicated matters, but it also presented new opportunities. If it was Toby's, a paternity test would be crucial evidence. If, by some chance, it was mine, that would significantly impact the custody battle. That night, as Crystal slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts turbulent. The man I had been trusting, optimistic, perhaps naive, was gone. In his place was someone harder, colder, a man who would stop at nothing to protect what was his. I thought of Victoria, innocent and oblivious to the turmoil surrounding her. I would shield her from the worst of it, but I knew the upcoming months would alter her life forever. The guilt of that weighed on me, but it was overshadowed by a stronger emotion: determination. Crystal and Toby had attempted to ruin me, to dismantle my family. Instead, they had unleashed a force they hadn't foreseen. I would have my revenge, my justice, and when the dust settled, I would rebuild my life from the ruins of their deceit. As dawn broke, I finally drifted into sleep. In my dreams, I stood victorious over the wreckage of Crystal's meticulously fabricated lies, a vision of the future I was resolute to realize. The knock on my office door jolted me from my reverie. I looked up to see Detective Fred Phillips in the doorway, his keen eyes scrutinizing every aspect of my office. "Mr. Bell," he said, his voice gruff but professional, "I'm Detective Phillips. I was hoping we could talk about Toby Rowe." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, my face a mask of composed concern. "Of course, Detective, please have a seat." But as Phillips settled in, I noticed his gaze flit over my face, searching for any sign of nervousness or guilt. I met his eyes firmly, determined not to reveal anything. "Mr. Bell, where were you on the night of July 15th? Phillips asked, pulling out a notepad. I leaned back in my chair, the picture of relaxation. I was working late with my friend Santos Witt. "We're implementing a new security system for my company. Can anyone else corroborate that?" I shook my head. "Just Santos." "We were the only ones in the office that night." Phillips scribbled something down, his expression inscrutable. "And your relationship with Mr. Rowe? I understand he worked with your wife." "Purely professional," I replied. I responded calmly. We had met at a few work events, but I didn't know him well. The detective's gaze sharpened slightly. "Your wife seems quite distressed by his passing," he observed. I let a hint of concern flicker across my face. "Crystal has always been empathetic. Any death weighs heavily on her, particularly that of a co-worker," I see Phillips murmured. He paused, then continued, "Mr. Bell, are you aware that Mr. Rowe made several substantial cash withdrawals in the weeks prior to his death?" My heart rate increased, but I maintained a neutral expression. "No, I wasn't aware." "Is that significant?" Phillips shrugged. "It might be nothing, but in my experience, when individuals start moving large sums of money, they're usually plotting something." I leaned in, injecting just the right amount of curiosity into my tone. "Planning what exactly? That's what we're trying to figure out," Phillips replied, standing. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Bell. We'll be in touch if we have any more questions." As I watched him depart, I knew this was far from resolved. Phillips was astute, too astute. I'd need to be exceedingly cautious. Later that evening, I arrived home to find Crystal pacing in the living room, her complexion pale and distressed. "Salvador," she said, her voice quivering, "the police were here. They asked so many questions about Toby." I drew her into a hug, feeling her body tremble against mine. "It's okay, Crystal. They're just doing their job." She stepped back, her eyes frantic. "But what if they discover?" "What if I interjected?" My voice steady, gripping her shoulder. "Find out what, Crystal?" "We have nothing to conceal." The lie lingered heavily between us, unspoken. Crystal's gaze shifted away, unable to meet mine. I just meant about the project we were working on," she mumbled. "It was confidential." I nodded, feigning acceptance of her flimsy excuse. "Don't worry, everything will be fine." As Crystal withdrew to the bedroom, I poured myself a drink, my thoughts racing. The investigation was progressing faster than I had anticipated. I needed to expedite my plans. I pulled out my phone, dialing Santos. "We need to talk," I said as soon as he answered. "Things are heating up." Santos's tone was low and grave. "My place. 1 hour. Come alone." I arrived at Santos's apartment exactly an hour later. He ushered me in quickly, scanning the hallway before closing the door. "What's going on?" he queried, pouring us each a shot of tequila. I downed mine in one gulp, savoring the burn. "Detective Phillips is onto something. He knows about Toby's cash withdrawals." Santos cursed under his breath. "That complicates things." "We need to throw him off the scent," I said, refilling my glass. Santos's eyes flashed with a perilous glint. "I've got some contacts in the department. Maybe we can plant some evidence, point them in another direction." I hesitated. "That's risky, Santos. If we get caught." "If we don't do something, you're going down for murder." Santos snapped back. The word hung heavy in the air between us. Murder. What I'd done finally had a name, and its weight threatened to crush me. But then I thought of Crystal's betrayal, of the life she and Toby had planned to steal from me. "Do it," I said, my voice icy. "Whatever it takes." Santos nodded, a smile on his face. "That's my boy. Now here's what we're going to do." As Santos laid out his plan, I felt a mix of fear and thrill. There was no turning back now. The game had changed, and I was all in. The house was silent when I returned home, Crystal already asleep or pretending to be. I made my way to the study, needing a moment to gather my thoughts. As I settled into my chair, my gaze landed on a stack of papers on Crystal's desk. Something about them drew me in. I knew I shouldn't look, but the investigator in me couldn't resist. Carefully, I began sifting through the documents. Most were mundane work papers, but then I found a hidden compartment in the desk drawer filled with letters and printed emails. My hands trembled as I read through them, each word stabbing deeper into my heart. My dearest Toby, one letter began, "I can't wait to start our new life together. Salvador suspects nothing." Another email outlined their plans. "Once we drain his accounts, we'll disappear. He'll be left with nothing, just like he deserves." The brutality of their plan struck me like a physical assault. They hadn't merely intended to leave me, they aimed to obliterate me entirely. As I continued reading, my shock morphed into fury. How could they, after all I had given Crystal, everything we had constructed together? I was so absorbed in the letters that I failed to notice the study door opening. Salvador Crystal's voice startled me. I turned slowly, the incriminating letters in my grasp. Crystal's eyes widened as she realized what I had uncovered. "Let me explain," she began, but I interrupted her with a bitter laugh. "Explain what, Crystal? How you and your lover planned to devastate me? How you were set to take my daughter, my money, everything?" Crystal's face collapsed. "It wasn't like that. Toby, he convinced me. Don't you dare pin this on him," I snarled, rising to my feet. "Every word here is yours, your plans." Your betrayal tears streamed down Crystal's face. "Salvador, please. I made a mistake. We can work this out." I looked at her, really looked, and felt nothing but disdain. This woman, whom I had loved and trusted, was now a stranger to me. "Work it out," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Oh, we'll work it out all right, but not in the way you're hoping." Crystal took a step back, fear evident in her eyes. "What do you mean?" I smiled coldly, and she flinched at the iciness in it. "You wanted to strip everything from me, Crystal. Now, I'm going to return the favor." "You can't," she whispered. "The baby," yes, the baby," I interrupted. "Tell me, Crystal, is it even mine, or is this just another part of your twisted game?" Crystal's silence was all the confirmation I needed. I laughed bitterly. "Get out of my sight," I commanded, turning back to the desk. "And Crystal, don't even think about running. You won't get far." I heard her muffled sobs as she fled the room, but I felt no pity. All I harbored was a burning desire for justice, or perhaps it was revenge. The next morning I called Santos. "I need your help again," I stated without preamble. I found more about Crystal. Santos let out a low whistle. "Damn it, what do you want to do?" "I want to destroy her," I replied, my voice icy. "Legally, financially, completely." "Can you help?" There was a pause. Then Santos chuckled darkly. "Oh, I can help. All right, meet me in an hour. We've got work to do." As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the window. The man staring back was harder, colder than the Salvador Bell of a few weeks ago, but he was also stronger, ready for war. The plan Santos and I devised was simple yet cunning. We would make Crystal believe I was on the verge of confessing everything to the police. The fear of exposure would drive her to desperate actions, right into our trap. I began by dropping hints, leaving files about Toby's case conspicuously around the house, and making hushed phone calls just within Crystal's hearing, speaking vaguely about coming clean and facing the consequences. The impact on Crystal was immediate and intense. She became jittery, her eyes constantly flicking around, as if expecting the police to burst in at any moment. One evening, as we sat in tense silence at the dinner table, I decided to escalate. "I can't do this anymore, Crystal," I declared, my voice heavy with feigned guilt. "The lies, the secrets, it's eating me alive." Crystal's fork clattered to her plate. "What are you talking about, Salvador?" I met her gaze steadily. "I think it's time I talked to Detective Phillips. Tell him everything I know." The color drained from Crystal's face. "Everything you know about what about Toby?" I said softly. "About you." Crystal shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't, Salvador. Please think about Victoria." I stood up slowly, letting my expression crumble into one of anguish. "I am thinking about Victoria. She deserves the truth, even if it hurts." As I turned to leave the room, I heard Crystal's sharp intake of breath. Then, suddenly, a searing pain exploded in the back of my head. I stumbled, turning to see Crystal standing there, a heavy vase clutched in her hands, her eyes wild, desperate. "I won't let you ruin everything," she hissed, raising the vase again. But this time I was ready. I ducked under her swing, tackling her to the ground. We scuffled on the floor, Crystal clawing and scratching like a cornered beast. Eventually I pinned her arms above her head, my face inches from hers. "It's over, Crystal." I know everything. She went limp beneath me, tears streaming down her face. "How? How did you find out?" I laughed bitterly. "You weren't as clever as you thought. I found your letters, your emails. I know all about your plans with Toby." Crystal's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in anger. "You had no right." "I had every right," I snarled. "You were scheming to destroy me, take my daughter, my money, my life." "You don't understand," Crystal sobbed. "Toby and I, we were in love. We wanted a fresh start." I released her arms, standing up and looking down at her with contempt. "And that justified ruining me, taking Victoria away from her father." Crystal struggled to sit up, her voice pleading. "Salvador, please, we can sort this out for Victoria's sake." "Don't you dare use our daughter as a bargaining chip," I snapped. "You lost that right when you plotted to take her from me." I pulled out my phone, showing her the screen the voice recorder app had been running the entire time. Crystal's face crumpled as she realized the trap she'd fallen into. "What are you going to do?" I smiled coldly. "Everything you planned to do to me, Crystal. I'm going to take it all: your money, your reputation, custody of Victoria. You'll be left with nothing." "You can't," she whispered. "Watch me," I replied, turning towards the door. "Oh, and Crystal, don't bother trying to run. Santos has been watching the house. You're not going anywhere." As I walked out, leaving Crystal sobbing on the floor, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth was out, and now, finally, I could begin to regain control of my life. But as I got into my car to drive to Santos's place, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Detective Phillips was still out there, getting closer to the truth every day. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, ready for whatever came next. Crystal and Toby had ignited a ruthless determination in me to protect what was mine, no matter the cost. As I pulled up to Santos's apartment, I saw him waiting outside, a smile on his face. "It's done?" he asked as I got out of the car. I nodded, holding up my phone. "Got it all on tape. She confessed everything." Santos clapped me on the shoulder. "Good man. Now let's go inside and plan our next move. Something tells me we're not out of the woods yet." As we walked into his apartment, I felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The game had changed, the stakes higher than ever, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had the upper hand. Crystal, Toby, Detective Phillips, they had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. The dim light of Santos's apartment cast long shadows as we pored over the evidence we'd gathered. Photographs, bank statements, and Crystal's damning emails were spread across the coffee table. "Something's not adding up," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "These withdrawals from Toby's account, they're too precise, too calculated." Santos leaned in, his brow furrowed. "What are you thinking, S?" I pointed to a series of transactions. "Look at the pattern. It's almost like someone was setting him up." Santos finished, his eyes widening. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces started to fall into place. "Santos, what if Toby isn't dead?" Santos sat back, shock evident on his face. "But you said." "I know what I thought I saw," I interrupted. "But what if it was staged? What if this whole thing has been an elaborate con?" Santos shook his head. "That's a hell of a long shot, S. Why would Toby fake his own death?" I stood up, pacing the room as my mind whirled. Think about it, the perfect crime. He frames me for his murder, runs off with Crystal and my money, and they start a new life somewhere I can't reach them. "But Crystal's still here," Santos pointed out. "Is she? Can we be certain, or is she just biding her time to vanish?" Santos's gaze sharpened. "If you're right, we need to act quickly. Where do we start?" I pulled out my phone, dialing a number I had hoped never to use again. "We start by calling in some favors. It's time to delve deeper into Toby Rose." Past hours later, fueled by coffee and desperation, we had our answer. Toby Rowe wasn't just alive, he was a phantom, a master of disguise with a string of aliases and scams across 3 continents. "I'll be damned," Santos whispered as we examined the evidence. He's fooled us all. Anger surged through me, hot and fierce. Not yet, he hasn't. We're going to beat him at his own game. Santos looked at me, admiration in his eyes. What's the play? Boss, I smiled. A plan already taking shape. We're going to catch a dead man the next morning. I cornered Crystal in the kitchen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her movements jittery as she poured her coffee. We need to talk, I said, my voice low and controlled. Crystal flinched. Salvador, please. I've told you everything. I leaned against the counter, fixing her with a stern look. Have you? Because I think there's one very important detail you've left out. Her hand trembled, coffee spilling over the rim of her mug. I don't know what you're talking about. Toby's alive, isn't he? I said, watching her reaction closely. The color drained from Crystal's face. For a moment I thought she might faint. Then, to my surprise, she laughed a hollow, bitter sound. You figured it out, she said, slumping into a chair. I should have known you would. I sat across from her, my voice cold. Start talking, Crystal. Tell me everything, and I mean everything. And so the whole sordid tale came pouring out. Toby's real identity, their elaborate plan to frame me and escape with my fortune. With each word my anger grew, but so did my resolve. Where is he now? I demanded when she finished. Crystal shook her head. I don't know. He was supposed to contact me. Her voice trailed off, fear flickering in her eyes. I stood up, looming over her. Listen carefully, Crystal. You're going to help me find him. And when we do, you're going to play your part perfectly. Understand? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. What are you going to do? I smiled, a predatory gleam in my eye. I'm going to give Toby exactly what he wants. And then I'm going to take everything from him. As I left the kitchen, my phone buzzed a text from Santos. Detective Phillips is snooping around again. I typed back a quick reply, set it up. It's time to end this. I went to the meeting, leaving Victoria and Crystal with Tracy. We explained everything to Detective Phillips with the evidence we gathered. He was initially suspicious of us, but as he pieced everything together, he was shocked. Before we wrapped up the meeting, I received a horrifying call from Tracy. Salvador, Toby came to the house. He took Victoria and Crystal with him. By force he gave me an address and told you to come alone, with all the savings and money that you have, also warning you to come alone. I was stunned. I relayed everything to Detective Phillips and Santos. Detective Phillips immediately organized a rescue team and gave me instructions to follow. An hour later, we were ready to confront Toby. The pieces were now in place for the final act in this twisted drama. The warehouse loomed before me, a hulking shadow against the night sky. My heart pounded as I approached, acutely aware of the wire hidden beneath my shirt and the gun tucked into my waistband. Santos's voice crackled in my earpiece. Remember, S, we've got eyes on every exit. If Toby shows, we'll catch him. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. And if he doesn't, then we've still got Crystal's confession. Either way, this ends tonight. I pushed open the rusted door, stepping into the cavernous space. Moonlight seeped through broken windows, casting eerie shadows across discarded machinery. Crystal, I called out, my voice echoing. A muffled sob answered me. I rounded a corner to find Crystal tied to a chair, her face streaked with tears and mascara. Salvador, she cried, thank God you're here. He said he'd harm Victoria if I didn't cooperate. I rushed to her side, pretending to check her bonds. Who, Crystal? Who did this? That would be me, a familiar voice declared. I spun around to see Toby stepping out from behind a stack of crates, a gun aimed at us. The sight of him alive, smirking, sent a surge of rage through me. Toby, I growled, or should I say James Maud. That is your real name, isn't it? Toby's eyes widened fractionally, then narrowed. Well, aren't you full of surprises, Salvador? I must say, I'm impressed. I stepped back from Crystal. The game's over, Toby. The police are on their way. He laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Oh, I don't think so. You see, I've got an insurance policy. He gestured towards a dark corner. My blood ran cold as Victoria stepped into view, her small hand held by a burly man I didn't recognize. Daddy, Victoria's voice trembled. What's going on? I took a step forward, my hands raised. Let her go, Toby. This is between us. Toby's grin widened. On the contrary, Salvador, this has always been about family, your family, to be precise. What do you want? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. What I've always wanted, Toby replied. Your money, your life, your identity. And now, thanks to your meddling, I'll have to take your daughter too. Can't leave any loose ends, you understand?" Crystal let out a strangled cry. "Toby, no, you promised." Toby's face twisted in disgust. "Oh, shut up, Crystal. You've outlived your usefulness." In that moment, several things happened at once. Toby swung his gun towards Crystal, and I lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. Through my earpiece, I heard Santos shout. Now the warehouse erupted into chaos. Police officers swarmed in from every entrance. The man holding Victoria was quickly subdued. I grappled with Toby on the floor, fighting for control of the gun. "It's over, Toby," I grunted, pinning his arm. "Give it up." Toby's eyes blazed with fury. "Never," he snarled, headbutting me. I reeled back, my grip loosening. Toby scrambled to his feet, gun raised. Time seemed to slow as I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. Then, a single shot rang out. Toby's eyes widened in shock. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, then crumpled to the ground. I turned to see Detective Phillips lowering his weapon. "You all right, mister?" Bell, I nodded, still dazed. "Victoria's safe," Phillips assured me. "We've got her." As the adrenaline faded, the full weight of what had happened hit me. I sagged against a nearby crate, watching as paramedics rushed to Toby's side. Santos appeared at my elbow, his face etched with concern. "You did it, S. It's over." I shook my head, my eyes fixed on Crystal as she was led away in handcuffs. "Not yet. There's still one more thing to do." In the days that followed, the truth came out. Facing a mountain of evidence, Crystal confessed to everything. Her testimony, combined with the evidence we had gathered, was enough to completely clear my name. As I sat in my lawyer's office signing the final divorce papers, I felt a mix of relief and a deep, abiding anger at the betrayal I'd endured. "Mr. Bell," my lawyer said, interrupting my thoughts, "there's one more matter to discuss. Your ex-wife. She's requesting visitation rights for Victoria." I looked up, my jaw clenching. "Absolutely not. She lost that right when she put our daughter in danger." The lawyer nodded. "I thought you might say that. I'll have the papers drawn up to ensure full custody remains with you." As I left the office, I felt lighter than I had in months. The nightmare was over. Toby was dead, Crystal was facing years in prison, and most importantly, Victoria was safe. I drove to pick up my daughter from Santos's place, my mind already turning to the future. We had a lot of healing to do, Victoria and I, but we would do it together, stronger for having survived this ordeal. As I pulled into Santos's driveway, I saw Victoria burst out of the front door, her face lighting up at the sight of me. I scooped her into my arms, holding her tight. "Ready to go home, Princess?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Victoria nodded against my chest. "Can we get ice cream on the way?" I laughed, feeling truly happy for the first time in a long time. "Anything you want, sweetheart. Anything you want." As we drove away, I caught sight of Santos in the rearview mirror, watching us go. I owed him more than I could ever repay, but that was a conversation for another day. For now, I had a daughter to spoil, a life to rebuild, and a future that, for the first time in a long time, looked bright. Months passed, and slowly, life began to settle into a new normal. The media frenzy around the Bell affair, as they dubbed it, had finally died down. Victoria and I had moved to a new house, a fresh start away from the painful memories of our old life. I sat in my home office reviewing some contracts when my phone buzzed with a text from Santos. "Turn on the news now." Frowning, I flipped on the TV. Crystal's face filled the screen, her once perfect makeup now absent, her designer clothes replaced by a prison jumpsuit. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. "Crystal Bell, convicted conspirator in the infamous Bell affair, has made a full confession implicating several high-profile individuals in a wide-ranging financial fraud scheme." I leaned back in my chair, a mix of emotions washing over me. Part of me was satisfied to see Crystal facing the consequences of her actions, but another part, a part one, tried to ignore, felt a twinge of something, not quite regret, but a sort of melancholy for what might have been. My musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," I called. Victoria peeked her head in, her eyes bright. "Daddy, can we go to the park?" "You promised we'd practice soccer," I smiled, pushing thoughts of Crystal aside. "Of course, Princess. Let me just finish up here." As Victoria skipped off to get ready, I turned back to the TV. Crystal was speaking now, her voice trembling. "I made terrible mistakes," she said, looking directly into the camera. "I hurt people I claim to love. If I could take it all back, I would. But I can't. All I can do now is tell the truth and face the consequences. I switched off the TV, sighing heavily. The truth, a simple concept, yet it had nearly destroyed us all. Later at the park, I watched Victoria chase after the soccer ball, her laughter carrying across the field. Santos jogged up, slightly out of breath. "Sorry I'm late," he panted. "Work's been crazy since the news broke." I nodded, my eyes still on Victoria. "What's the fallout?" Santos shook his head. "It's Big S. Crystal's testimony has opened up a whole can of worms. Arrests, indictments, it's like dominoes falling." I turned to face him. "And us?" "Are we in the clear completely?" Santos assured me. "Detective Phillips even called to apologize for suspecting you. Said you should consider a career in law enforcement." I laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "I think I've had enough excitement for one lifetime." Santos clapped me on the shoulder. "Can't argue with that. So what's next for Salvador Bell?" I watched as Victoria scored a goal against an imaginary goalkeeper, her arms raised in triumph. Honestly, I'm not sure. But for the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to finding out. We lapsed into comfortable silence, the afternoon sun warming our faces. After a while, Santos spoke again, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Listen, S, about everything that happened. I know I didn't always make the right choices. If I let you down in any way," I cut him off with a shake of my head. "You were there when it mattered, Santos. I wouldn't have made it through without you." Santos nodded, relief evident in his eyes. "Still, if there's ever anything you need." "Actually," I said, a smile playing at my lips, "there is one thing. Victoria's been asking for a dog. Think you could help me pick one out?" Santos laughed, the tension easing. "A dog, that's it? After everything we've been through?" I shrugged. What can I say? My priorities have changed. As we walked over to join Victoria's impromptu soccer game, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The past few months had been a crucible, burning away everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and even myself. But from those ashes, something new had emerged, a stronger bond with my daughter, a deeper appreciation for true friendship, and a resolve to never again take for granted the things that truly mattered. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt ready to face whatever came next. As Victoria's small hand slipped into mine, her face beaming up at me, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. And really, that was all that mattered. The sun was setting as we left the park, casting long shadows across the grass. Victoria skipped ahead, chattering excitedly about the dog we'd promised to consider. Santos hung back, matching my slower pace. "You know, S," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about priorities changing." I glanced at him, curious. "Oh," he nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's time I made some changes too. Settle down, start a family. All this cloak and dagger stuff, it takes its toll, you know." I chuckled, remembering the adrenaline-fueled days of our recent past. "That it does, my friend. That it does." As we reached the car, Victoria turned to us, her eyes shining. "Can Uncle Santos come for dinner, please, Daddy?" I looked at Santos, raising an eyebrow in question. He grinned, shrugging. "Well, if the lady insists." And so, as the last light of day faded, we drove home together, a family forged in fire, stronger for having weathered the storm. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: whatever came next, we'd face it head-on, with the unshakable bond of trust and loyalty we'd fought so hard to build. As I glanced in the rear-view mirror, catching Victoria's excited chatter with Santos, I felt a surge of determination. The past had tried to break us, but we'd emerged victorious. And now, finally, it was time to write a new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of better days ahead. This is where our story comes to an end. Thank you for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and now, I'll see you there.